Okay, good morning. So yesterday we got to the bottom of Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. I'm going to go back a little bit, and the Gemara was challenging a halacha that Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav taught us, and that is that if even though we know that a korban that was shechted shaloi lishma or if it's a chatos involved or a pesach involved, the korban is in ganz and puzzle. That's only if you had kavanah to a different korban. But if you had kavanah to chulin, which is what's considered totally out of the ballpark, which the Gemara phrases as the mina machriva, if you're going to have kavanah for a different korban, which is part of its minutes, kachim still, that has the impact to make it a korban shaloi l'shma, which would possible it. But if you have in zin to make it chulin, which is like out of the arena completely, at so no shaykhis, that's not even a kavana that could be chal on the korban that would even possible. That was the chiddush that Rav said, and the Gemara challenged it from a case of Tumah and Tahira, which is not exactly the same case, but it's a similar comparison that something that has no shaykhis wouldn't be able to impact something that has no shaykhis to. So I'm going to go back to about a third of the Amud from the bottom, Verama Milsa Achriti, and he asked another kasha. Mi Amar Rabbi Yud Amarav, did Rabbi Yud Amarav really say that Chata sheshachtu l'shem oila psula, but shachta l'shem chulin is ksera? Alma the mina machriba, the loy mina loy machriba. If it's so out of the arena, then it's not a kavana that will even impact it. But Tanya, we learned the halacha is that if you have a big oven that's made out of cheres, and there's a sheretz in it, the sheretz will be mitama the oven, and if there's a Michael in it, then the Michael will become Tomei because it's in the airspace of the oven that also had a sheretz in its airspace. And the Torah says anything kol haba el toichai will become Tomei. Anything that comes into the inside of the klicheres is Tomei. And we learn from there that a klicheres does not become Tomei if something Tomei touches it. Rather, it becomes Tomei if something Tomei is within its airspace. So too, a oven of klicheres will not transmit tuma by touching something. Rather, the oven transmits tuma through toichai if something is within its airspace. So imagine you have an oven, and you have a sheretz in its airspace, and you had food in another klicheres, and that klicheres was somewhat submerged into the oven, into the larger klicheres, but it wasn't all the way submerged, and therefore the top rim of this keli that contained the food was out of the opening to the oven. So the access to this keli, the opening to this keli, was above the opening to the oven. So that means the airspace of this keli is not exposed to the airspace of the klicheres. So in that case, the food inside the inner keli would not become tamei. Vatanya toichai v'loy toichai. Not if it's inside the inside, meaning it's in this keli. And that doesn't only apply to a klicheres. That does not only apply to Michael or Mishta that's in the klicheres, which the klicheres we know cannot become tamei if something touches its outer walls. And like we said earlier, a klicheres could only be tamei if tuma gets into its airspace. And here there's no tuma in its airspace. Zok Braisa, that doesn't only apply to a klicheres, but afilu klei shetef matzil. Even if the keli that the Michael was in, that was submerged partially into the oven, even if that's a metal keli. Now, a metal keli, we know if a sheretz touches a metal keli on the outside, it will make the keli tamei. Yet, if it's in the airspace of a klicheres that has a tuma in it, the tuma will not penetrate that klishetef. Now, that's a huge chiddush because a klishetef shouldn't be able to be mafsik a klicheres because it's the loymina. It has no shaykhis to it. So the Gemara says if you hold the loymina, if you have injin for chulin, it won't pass a korban. So too, klishet of a metal keli should not be able to be a mechitza mipnei hatuma when we're talking about a kli cheres. So toicha v'loy toich toichai, v'afilu klishet of matzil. V'sheni, v'shani, and the answer that he gave, the Rava gave to this kasha, was that you're not comparing it properly. Also, chulun etzel kachim, which we consider as the lav mina, and therefore, if they had a wrong kavanah to chulun, that's what that's comparable to, not to a klishetet. That's comparable to mechitza etzel tamer. A mechitza is not even a keli. A klishetet, you're right, it's not made out of cheres, but it is within the ballpark. It's a keli, just like the oven that it's in is a keli. You want to know what's out of the ballpark? Out of the ballpark is if I take an oven that's made out of cheres and I build a barrier inside it to be mafsik between one half of the oven and the other half of the oven with wood or with a curtain. So that is so no shaykhs, that's not mafsik. So therefore, also chulun etzel kachim kemechitza etzel taner. Ma mechitza etzel taner. Just like if you make some type of barrier in the taner that's not made out of cheres, it's made out of wood or made out of a curtain. Loy mahan yolah klal. It would not be considered a hefsek. It's nothing. Af chulun etzel kachim loy mahan yolah klal. So too a kavana to make a carbon chulun when it's really a carbon, that machshava will not possible at all. It's out of the area. The Tanan Biller, taner shechat tu b'nisar. If I had a taner and I made a barrier in it to split it into two halves with wood, oy b'yiriyos, or with a curtain, v'nimta sheretz b'makam echad, and on one side of this barrier there's a sheretz. Anything that's anywhere in the oven, even on the other side of the barrier, hakoyel tomei. What about keveres shehi pchusa ufakuka b'kash? You had a basket. The baskets are often referred to as a beehive. It was in the shape of a beehive, I guess, and it wasn't a complete keli because it had a hole in it. It had a hole in the side, and that hole was stuffed with some kash. So it's not really a full keli because now it has a hole in it, and that blocking it up with kash doesn't really give it a shem keli anymore. Umishul shelas lavir tank, and it was hanging off a string suspended in midair inside the avir of a taner. Sheretz b'soicha. If there's a sheretz in that keveres, hataner tomei, the taner will be tomei because that's not a keli. It's just a barrier that has no shaykhs to cheres, and we don't say that it's mafsik. It's not mafsik, and it will in fact be matama the entire oven, or vice versa. Sheretz b'taner. If there was a sheretz b'taner, oichlin sheb'soicha tmei, and any oichel that's in this keveres will be tomei because it won't be matzel because it's not a keli. It's just no different than a wall inside a keli, which would not be mafsik. Rabbi Eliezer Matayr, Rabbi Eliezer is Matayr. Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, you know why I'm Matayr? I have a kal v'chomer to be Matayr. Kal v'chomer. Im hitzel b'meis hachomer. Now the halacha is, if there's a mace in the oil, everything in that oil becomes tummy. But what if we put up a curtain inside the oil and we split the oil into two parts? Then only the part of the oil that the mace is in becomes tummy. But if you're on the other side of the curtain, you're considered to be in a different oil, and you're not going to be tummy. So Zokter Eliezer Madach, a curtain, could be mafsik. Tumas mace, which is a tumah chamura, it requires hazah, shlishu, shvi, it requires the paraduma. It's a very severe tumah. Nevertheless, a simple little curtain can stop that tumah from getting into the other side of the oil. So therefore, loisatzel b'chlicheres akal. Surely, if we're only talking about a tumah sheretz, surely a mere barrier should be mafsik. That's what Rabbi Eliezer's argument was. Amru loy, so they told him it's not a good kavachid. Loy im amru, and let's turn on to the base. Loy im hitzel b'meisa chomer. You know why a little vila and a little barrier can be mafsik in oil? That's because shekein chaluka oilin. Because it's a normal thing to do to put a barrier inside a bigger room to make it into two smaller rooms. You do those things. As Rashi says, Eloi metila mechita b'meisa chamer ba'oil ameis shamechita mafsekes, and therefore the kalim sheme'ever asheni tahir, and therefore a keli that's on the other side of this barrier is considered in a different oil. The kalim that are on the other side of the barrier, they're not considered in that oil. Why Zokt Rashi shekain choilkin derech b'nei adam lachluk oiholan b'mechitza? It's a normal thing to do. People build additional interior partitions to further partition off their oil to make an extra room. Therefore, hilchech oil lachvinahu. But will you extend the same svara tatzel b'chlicheres hakal she'ein chalukin ba'olin? By a klicheres, it doesn't work that way, as Rashi says. Tatzel b'chlicheres bitmiyah she'ein chalukin klicheres v'mechitos. It's not a normal thing to do to put up a curtain in a klicheres. That's why we don't consider it a proper barrier, as no shaykhs to it. So that's how the Rabbanon rebuffed the Taina, the Chavachomer of Rabbi Eliezer. Zok to Gemara, Hatainich l'Rabbanon. Our whole binyan over here works according to the Rabbanon, as Rashi says. The Amar Mechitza loy matzla. The Rabbanon hold a mechitza does not help. A mechitza in an oven doesn't help. So therefore, we for Emperor the Kash and Rab, Isla the Rab, the Omar, the Lav Mine loy machrepe. A barrier in a klicheres won't be mafsek, just like a kavana for a chulin on a carbon will not impact it at all. But the Rebbe Eliezer, ma'ikala meimar, Rebbe Eliezer says a barrier does impact a klicheres. So even if it's lav mina, it'll still impact. So according to Rebbe Eliezer, will Rav's halacha still stand that if the kavana was l'chulin, it won't passel? Zok to Gemara, what are you talking about? Rabbi Eliezer, Kal v'chomer kam. Avada, he would agree to Rav. The only reason why by Tumah and Tahira he makes a distinction is because by Tumah and Tahira he had a Kal v'chomer. Madich, the barrier is matzel. By an oil amaze, surely it should be a mafsik mipnei atuma kala of sheretz. Zok to Gemara, if you're telling me that Rabbi Eliezer only applies his chiddush where he has the special Kal v'chomer, well, guess what? You'll have the special Kal v'chomer by chulin and kochim as well. In Rav's case, where you had kavana for chulin when it was really a carbon, we can have a kal v'chomer there as well. Madich kodeshim mechal and kochim. If kochim could be mechal kochim, my kavana was still for kochim. It wasn't so far away. It was still closer to what its original intent was. Might have been a different carbon, but at least it's still kochim. Chulin, if you have a kavana for chulin, that totally defiles the kedusha, like all shagay. So the same kal v'chomer that Rabbi Eliezer made applies to this case as well. So once again, can Rabbi Eliezer or can Rav say his halacha and even be consistent with Rabbi Eliezer? Ela time of the Rav for Rabbi Lozer. The svara of Rav is because of what Rabbi Lozer said. The Amar Rabbi Lozer, my time of the Rav. What is the svara of Rav? That if it's chulin, it's the lav mina loy machriba. It says in the pasuk v'lo yechalalu es kachay b'nei Yisrael asher yarimu lasha. The pasuk says you should not do mechal kachay v'lo yechalalu es kachay b'nei Yisrael asher yarimu lashem. And the Gemara and Rabbi Elazar darshans it as follows: kachim mechalin kachim. Kachim could be mechal kachim ve'ein chulin mechalin kachim. So he has a drush of a pasuk. Yes, you have a kal v'chomer, but the pasuk says don't follow that kal v'chomer. Let's see Rashi. Elatamid Rabbi Elazar v'lo yichalu eskachay haki darishlei. Ein davar achar mechalel eskachay b'nei Yisrael. Only kachim will be mechal kachim, but chulin will not be mechal kachim. Ugzeres hakosov. It's exeres hakosov. So if it's exeres hakosov, there can be a carve out for a chulin, for a kavanah of chulin, when you're dealing with kachim, that would be inconsistent with your kal v'chomer.
How do you call it gezer zakosov if it's a drasha? It's not it's a drasha. So
from a drasha we learn not to make that kal v'chomer.
But they're both drushes. How does one
Now,
drush
Kavachomer is
trump
also
the
a
other
double Shatari the
drushes?
drushes by.
Right,
So how do you know which should the drasha take precedence over a Kavachomer?
right.
That's a good ha'ora. That's a good ha'ora. But at least there's a drasha. At least he has something. Now the question is why he chose to follow the drasha versus the Kavachomer, which is also a deraisa. It's another Shatari the drasha. I don't know. But Alma also kra afkim Kavachomer. You see that he follows the drasha of the pasuk, and he uses it to say that I'm not going to make that Kavachomer. Okay, so Frank the Gemara Hachanami. Guess what? By Tum and Tahira, you told me only as a Kavachomer, he doesn't have a drasha. There's a drasha that would impact Tum and Tahira as well. Why? Lacy Toichai Livke Mikavachomer. Because you have a drasha of Toichai, Zok Rashi. Hachanami Lesa Toichai Kro Yisera. There's actually we're going to see that there's 4 Toichais, because it says Toichai twice in the pasuk, and it could have said Toich each time. So the Gemara has 4 drushes to be made out of it. So we have extra drushes over here, and if we have extra drushes over here, let's say the same drusha as well, that the foreign matter, the barrier, should be mafsik. Hachanami laisi toichai livke mikavachomer. Zogt Gemara hai toichai mibayele laoichlun shegivlon betit v'chnisan la'avertaner. The toichai he's using not to say that this case shouldn't be tamei. Avada, the barrier won't help. But you know what we need toichai for? You need toichai for a different case. What happens if you did suspend food into the airspace of a tanner that was tamei, but the food was totally encapsulated with tit? So you wrapped a piece of food in tit. So now it's totally sealed in this tit, and it's not exposed directly to the airspace. The chnisan la'aver tanner. Sol kedai de chamina hoil uvenagina uvenagia aloy mitamei. Any toma, even if a share touches this tit, it will not be mitama the food inside. I would have thought ba'avira inami loy mitamu. There it wouldn't be tama either. Kamash malon that it is tame. So although a foreign barrier, according to Rabbi Eliezer, will be mafsik mipnei tuma, what we learn from Toichai is that if it's just wrapped in tit, that would not be mafsik mipnei tuma. How do the Rabbanon know this halacha? Because we're saying that they're using Toichai to tell you not like that. You don't need a pasuk to tell you that the tit is not mafsik. Why would it be mafsik? It's not a barrier. Okay, Kabaltik. Rabbi Yosy bar Abi Rami. Now we're learning all about kashas, all the kashas that we're discussing in the Bismedish. So we were talking about Rava's kashas in the Bismedish. Now Rabbi Yosy bar Ami Rami. He asked the following kasha. Shinu Kodesh Ashinu Baile. He asked a kasha from Shinu Kodesh. Shinu Kodesh is what we've been discussing until now. He had kavana for when he was shechting a korban chatos. He had kavana for a korban oil. Right there, we say it's possible. What about Ashinu Bailim? What about if the kavana was for the wrong person? So he had a kasha from the halach of Shinu Kodesh to the halach of Shinu Bailim, umashani, and he gave a teretz. Let's have a look at the kasha. Mi Amar Rav, did Rav actually say chatos shashachta l'shem chatos kshera l'shem oila psula? A chatos that you shechta l'shem chatos is going to be kosher. What it's a perfect textbook case of chatos. But if you shechta the chatos l'shem oila, the chatos will be psula. Alma, what do you see? The lav mina machriva, the mina loy machriva. So now we're talking about different shades of lav mina. Lav mina meaning the oila over chatos. Right before we were calling lav mina chulin compared to kachim. Now we're calling the lav mina is the oila will be machriv, and the mina, if you have kavanah to a chatos, it won't be machriv. How could you say that? The Omar Rav said,
At which point you're supposed to have kavana for, or at which point is the kavana? Is it the shchita or is it the zrika or where?
That's a very important point. It's a very important question. For now, it's going to change. But for now, at each avoida, you have to have the kavana for the right carbon and for the right person. So it's by each avoida. We're soon going to see that's not the case by shinu carbon. Rather, it's by the shchita. You have to have kavana to do the shchita l'shem chatos. By shchita, you have to have kavana to do the zrika l'shem chatos. By shchita, you have to have kavana to do the halacha l'shem chatos, and by the shchita, you have kavana to do the zrika l'shem chatos. But for now, let's assume it's just by each avodah. So chatos sheshach l'shem chatos. What does it mean? What it means is it's not a perfect case. Rather, it's chatos chelev sheshach l'shem chatos tam. So the case this was a chatos that was being brought to be mechaper on somebody who ate chelev b'shoigik, and the kohen had kavanah to be mechaper on dam. There, it's not a problem because it was the wrong kavanah. It was the wrong kavanah, but it was not for a different carbon. So we call that it's mina, and it's loy makraba because it's chatos l'shem chatos. But chatos l'shem oila, which is lav mina, you had kavanah for a different carbon, that will be machir. So that is the kasha. Miyam rav chatos sheshakta l'shem chatos kshera l'shem oila psula. Amo the lav mina machriba, the mina loy machriba. The Amar Rav said chatos sheshakta al mi shemechuyev chatos psula, but al mi shemechuyev oila kshera. If the kavanah, so now we're talking about a shinu bailam. If you shechted the chatos to be mechaper on Ruvain, who has a mechuyev chatos, it will be psula. Amisha mechuyev oila kshera. But if you shechted the chatos, amisha mechuyev oila will be kshera. What was the exact case? Zokt Rashi, via Amarav b'shinu bailam chatos Reuven. So Reuven brought a carbon chatos. Sheshachta lischaper ba Shimon, and the shoichet shechted it so that Shimon should have a kapara from it. Im Shimon mechuyev chatos psula. If Shimon is mechuyev chatos, then this is puzzle because it was brought lekavana for the wrong person. Aval im mechuyev oila v'loy chatos. But if Shimon is mechuyev and oila, not a chatos, so he's a lav mina. He's like his carbon is totally not relevant, and therefore will be kosher. Alma lav minei loy machrape. So Frank Yosy the following kasha. If we're talking about changing the kavana of what carbon it is, there, if it's mina, if you had kavana for a chatas, it won't be a problem. But if you had kavana for an oil, it would be a problem. Yet, when it's a question of shinu bailim, there, if I shechted Reuven's carbon with the kavana for Shimon, it will only passel if Shimon was also mechuyev chatos. But if Shimon has no shayches, Shimon was bringing an oila, then it wouldn't passel. So why is it that the halacha regarding a shinu bailim is different from the halacha involving a shinu carbon? Umishani, and how did Rabbi Yosef answer this tira? He said, "Hasam v'shachat oisa lechatos amarachman." The Torah says, "V'shachat oisa lechatos." You have to have zinin to bring it for a chatos. And therefore, if you had kavana to bring it for a chatos, even though it was for a different avera, for a dam, it doesn't make a difference. You did fulfill what the Torah stated. You had kavana for a chatos. But hacha, we have a problem. It says v'chiber alav ksiv. You have to have kavana for the right owner. Alav v'loy al chavera. Chavera don't meet today. The chaver is similar to his own carbon. Shemechuyev kapara kamoisa. You know what type of chaver you're not supposed to have kavana, wrong kavana to dedicate this carbon to. That's a chaver who requires a similar carbon. He's similar to him. But if your chaver only needs an oila, that is not excluded from v'chiper alav ksiv because it's a completely different carbon. So therefore, you can ask to be a stira between the halacha that applies to shinu carbon, where being mishana from one chatas to a different chatas will not passel, while when you're talking about shinu bailim, if it's from a chatas to an oila, it wouldn't pass. Rab Chaviva Rami. Now it's Rab Chaviva's chance to ask a stira from Shinu Bailim a Toich Toichai. From a case of Shinu Bailim to Toich Toichai. So before we were asking from Shinu Korban to Toich Toichai. Now we're going to ask from Shinu Bailim to Toich Toichai. Umeshani, and he answered. And here was the question. Umi Amarav, Chata Sheshachta al Misha Mechuyev Chatos Psula, but al Misha Mechuyev Oila Sheira, which is the case that we just quoted. Alma, what do you see? The Mina Machriba, if it's the right min Machriba, only if it's someone who was Mechuyev Achatos, and the Lav Mina Loy Machriba. But if this other person was not Mechuyev Achatos, it wouldn't impact the carbon. It's too far out. Aiva Tanya, we learned Toichai, Veloy Toich Toichai, Afilu Klishetev Matzil. So you see, even something that's so off the chart, so not in the arena, will be matzil, which is exactly the same kasha we just started with today on Amar Aleph, but now we're asking it relevant to Shinui Bailim. Umeshani Arba Toichai Ksivi. These are those toichais that we were talking about before, because twice the pasuk says toichai instead of the word toich. Toich toichai, toich toichai. Let's see the pasuk inside. It's a very small pasuk. Ve'el chol kli cheres. Asher yipol mehem el toichoi, koil asher be toichoi yitma. So I guess I could have said kol klicheres asher yipol mehem toich, or asher yipol toich klicheres, kol asher toichoi, kol asher toich yitma. Doesn't have to say toichoi. I'm not sure about my diktuk, but in either case, there's 4 extras over here. So we learn chad legufei. One is to tell you this halacha, that a klicheres is mitama bavira. The chad, and one is to tell you l'gzeir shava, which Rashi will tell us what that means in a second. Chad toichai shel zeh v'loy toichai shel achar, and idich toichai v'loy toich toichai v'afilu klishetev matzel. So we have psukim to dictate this. So let's see what these 4 things are. Chad is lukvei shitama oichle me'aviri, that a klicheres could be metama anything that's in its airspace. The chad l'gzeir shava. Now there's 2 halachas we have over here. A, if you have a klicheres that's tahar, if a tumah, like a sheretz, is suspended inside it, it will be metama, the keli, even though it never touched the keli. And the second chiddush is that if you have a tamedik tanner, that there's food suspended in, the tanner will turn around and be metama. So there's 2 halachas here. A is that the keli will be mekabel tumah through its aver, and B, the keli will be metama food through its aver. So that is the gzeir shava. Chad gzeir shava. Sheyitame sheretz es hakli v'afal pi shloi naga k'diyalef lo b'akol shaychtim. Because our pasuk says kol asher ba'al toichai, anything that comes in to a tamei oven becomes tamei in the airspace. But how do you know that the keli could be mekabel tumah through its airspace? That's what we learn from the extra toichai. Then we have a toich shalachar lemuti klei shetef mitumas aver elam keinaga. And then we have the lima that tells us that if it's a separate keli, even though it's a metal keli, it will be mafsek mepnei tumah. The chatoichai v'lo toichai to the precious loyal. So therefore, the pasuk is coming to tell us that even a regular keli, if the food is in the keli and the keli is somewhat suspended into the klicheres, that keli will be mafsek mepnei tumah. So therefore, since we have psukim to dictate that, you cannot ask me a kasha. Gewaltig. Now let's get back a little bit to the sugya of kachim that we're in. Minolon the be'inon zvicha lishma. We were talking about for the last couple of letter that if you shecht a chatas l'shem oila, the carbon will be possible. Now, or if you shechted any other carbon shaloi lishma, it will be kosher. But still, lechatchila, you have to shecht it lishma. How do you the halal know that there is such a halacha of shechting lishma? As Rashi says, "Uminalam de be'inan zvicha lishma lechatchila." The imi moitzes fasecha. If you remember it right at the beginning, the Gemara had a pasuk of moitzes fasecha v'osisa kasher nedarta. That's a very general thing, right? You should keep your word And therefore, if you don't keep your word, and if you had kavanah for the wrong thing, it blives like a nuna double, right? So that tells you that you're supposed to shecht it for the proper reason, but it's not very specific. It doesn't specifically mention any avoida that you have to have the right kavanah for. So I might have misspoke because I said it might include a chatas as well, but we just brought psukim to say that you have to shecht it for the right person and for the right carbon. How do we know, even by the karbanos that are only lechatchila, that are kosher, even if they're shechted not l'shem the right carbon, how do we know that lechatchila you have to shecht for the right reasons? The Omar Kra, it says in the pasuk, "Ve'im zevach shalomim karbanai." So this is going to be a pretty detailed Gemara. So let's have a look at the pasuk over here. Ve'im zevach shalomim karbanai, im min abokar hu makriv, im zocher im nekeva, tamim yakrivenu lefnei Hashem. So it says ve'im zevach shalomim karbanai. We dashin should hezvicha l'shem shlomim. So the im zevach shlomim doesn't mean if you brought a carbon and the name of the carbon is zevach shlomim. It means vim zevach if you're shechting a shlomim karbanai, meaning the shchita should be lishma. Frank the Gemara, who said that's what the pshat in the pasuk is? V'dil mahanu shmayu. Maybe vim zevach shlomim karbanai means the name of the carbon is zevach shlomim. It has like a compound name. But who said zevach is the verb that you have to shecht it l'shem shemayim, l'shem the proper carbon? So the Gemara, midichsiv, it already says hamakriv es dam hashlomim, hazoyrek es dam hashlomim. So you see there, the pasuk refers to the shlomim with its single name. It's not called zevach shlomim; it's called a regular shlomim. V'lo ksiv zevach, v'ha ksiv zevach. But here, when the Torah addresses the shlomim, it sticks in the word zevach shlomim. That zevach must not be part of the name. Rather, it's telling you that the zvicha has to be l'shem shlomim. Shma mina shetei zvicha l'shem shlomim. Now, the Gemara is going to want to know every little detail of a car for it. So, sai all four avoiders. How do you know that it has to be l'shem the right carbon? And sai all four avoiders. How do you know that it has to be l'shem the right bilim? So far, out of 8 components that we need, we've now solved one. Shchita has to be l'shma because it says v'im zevach shlomim. We still are going to need to know who said this applies to other commands besides shlomim. So that's also going to be require a makar. So every little detail is going to require a makar. Ashkron zvicha, shar avodos minala. How do you know that the other avodos, such as Kabbalah, Hoylacha, and Zrika, how do you know that those also have to be l'shma? V'chitema leilaf mizvicha. If you're going to say make a binyan av, just like their avodas, zvicha is an avodah. Just like zvicha has to be done l'shma, so too everything else has to be done l'shma. You can't bring a raya from there because mal zvicha shekain poiselas shaloi l'shem oichlin b'pesach. Shchita has a distinction because the halacha is carbon pesach is a very unique carbon. Every other carbon, even those that need to be eaten, there's no specific mitzvah on anybody to eat that carbon. You have to make sure it gets eaten. It shouldn't become nicer. The only carbon that there's a specific mitzvah for you, each individual, to eat is the carbon pesach. So therefore, what happens if someone shechs the carbon pesach and he has in mind which group is it for? A group of people that for some reason cannot possibly eat it. They're cholim, they're skenim, they cannot eat it. So you had kavona in the shchitas HaPesach, shaloi l'shem oichlin, that will be possible. Now, if you made the Kabbalah Saddam, or the Zrika Saddam, or the Eilocha Saddam, if you had kavana there, shaloi l'shem oichlin, it wouldn't impact it. It's only the shchita. So you see the shchita is a unique avodah, because by a carbon Pesach, it has to have a special kavana. So maybe since Zvicha is unique, maybe that's why Zvicha always has to be l'shem carbon. But how do you know that this chumer applies to the other avodas?
How do we know that Zvicha means shchita? Is that what the word means, actually?
I think so. There's a vachta v'achalta. I mean, the word Zvicha is used in the Torah even when we're not even talking about karbanos. So I think so. But that's a good point. That has to be clarified as well. But that's what I assume. That's what I had assumed. Ella Omar Kra. So we need a makar now that the other avodas have to be done the shema as well. It says hamakriv es dam hashlomim. Shetehei Kabbalah l'shem shlomim. It says Hamakrib is Tama Shlomim, which is referring to Kabbalah, and therefore, we see that it also has to be l'shem Shemai. Fragt die Gemara, v'lichtev rachmana b'Kabbalah v'leilav shchita mina. Why did the Torah teach us the Zevachim Shlomim to tell you that the shchita has to be l'shema? Memela, you explained why we can't learn the other avoiders from shchita, because shchita is unique, because it has to be l'shema on Pesach. But now that we have a pasuk that tells you that the Kabbalah has to be l'shema, so now let's learn all of the other avoiders from Kabbalah. Zok to Gemara, you can't do that either. Mishum the ikal mifrach mal Kabbalah shekein psula bizar v'isha. Kabbalah Saddam is azar, cannot do Kabbalah Saddam. Azar can do shchita, and an isha can do shchita. The ikal mifrach mal Kabbalah shekein psula bizar v'isha. Now this sounds like a benign little line, but this two words shekein psula bizar v'isha creates a firestorm in the world of the Rishonim and the Poskim. Let's just look at a little tiny little thing in our Tziyonim under Beis. Ve'isha nimchak shita mikubetes. The shita mikubetes takes out the word ve'isha. Sounds like a benign little thing. There's a massive shaila. Is an isha considered a zar? If a zar, v'azar akarev yumas, an isha might be possible for avodah. Will she be chayiv misa? Does she have the status of a zar? And the Rambam says that a zar is anybody who's not a male kohen, who's gemalit, which means an isha would be a zar. But there are other places where it's mashma not like. So there's a huge firestorm as to whether or not an isha is considered a zar. Because maybe we're learning out of different psukim. Because an isha that's possible, we might learn out of different psukim. The other question is an isha kosher for shchita? It's mashma that an isha could do shchita, right? So there's a big big question in the poskim, because one of the first that's right. So I believe that it says a woman is allowed to shecht a korban, but the Shulchan Aruch tells us that a woman is not allowed to shecht chulin. So that's a steer right there. So one of the Mefarshim say could be you could be mechalek between chulin and truma, between chulin and kachim, and you'd have to say that kachim would be less chomerdik than chulin, because we don't allow to shech chulin, but the average shchita for kachim would be kosher. So it's two little words, but there's a huge firestorm about it. Ashkechon shchita v'kabbalah. So far we've covered shchita, we've covered kabbalah, that they have to be l'shema. Zrika minolim. If you noticed, what was omitted over here was halacha. The Gemara jumps over halacha and goes to zrika minolam. V'chitei meyalef mahani. If you're going to say learn it, we know by shchita needs l'shema, we know by kabbalah needs l'shema. So zrika as well. Zok Gemara no. Malahani shekein to unois tzafon. The kabbalah has to be done by the tzafon, because we know the shchita has to be done on the tzafon side of the zara. And the Kabbalah is done right there where the Shechita is done. But the Zrika doesn't have to be B'tzafay. That's one Chomer that these two have. And V'yeshnon B'chatoyis HaPnimiyos. And Shechita and Kabbalah you do by a Chatos HaPnimi. But you don't do Zrika on the Mizbeach HaChitzoin by the Chatos HaPnimi. It's called the Chatos HaPnimi specifically because it's dam is spritzed on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. But they don't have that Mila that their dam is spritzed on the Mizbeach HaChitzoin. Ella Omar Kra. So now we need a pasuk for Zrika as well. It says, "Azoyrek is dama shlomim shetei Zrika l'shem shlomim." So now we've covered 3 of the 4 avodos. Yet we need a pasuk for each one of these 3 because you would not be able to learn one out of the other. In fact, Gemara, the lichtoi brachmana bezrika v'leilef mina. Let's learn shchita and kabbalah out of Zrika. So Gemara, you wouldn't be able to do that either. You should be equal to mifrach mal Zrika shekin chayiv Allah zar misa. If a zar does zrika, he will be chayiv misa. Even though a zar is not allowed to do kabbalah, and he's allowed to do shchita, he's for sure not chayiv misa. So zrika is distinct that you're chayiv misa. And we're going to see that even though a zar is not allowed to do any avodah, there's a very small subset of avodas that if a Zor did, they would be chayiv misa for, and it has to be an avodah tama, v'loy avodah sheyesh achara avodah. It has to be the final avodah in the set. Zrika is the final in the set. Kabbalah is just in preparation for halacha and for zrika. Zrika is the final. That's the only avodah for which, the only type of avodah for which it would be a chiv misa. Okay, so ashkechan kulu, we got them all. Halacha minala. This in and of itself is a little funny lashon. What do you mean ashken kulu? We got all the avodas. What about halacha? Isn't halacha one of the four avodas? Why is halacha considered a different avodah? We're going to soon see that halacha is distinct from the other avodas. It's maybe not an avodah, because what happens if you shechted right near the mizbeach? So you don't need to make halacha. You're right there. You can do kabbalah and zrika without even making a move. So halacha is not an avodah that's always necessary. Sometimes halacha wouldn't be necessary at all. So therefore, that's why it might not be considered in the group of avodas. That's why it says ashkan kulu halacha minalan, because halacha isn't on the same level as a required avodah. Because if it's only required, if it's necessary from a practical perspective. Tomer by halacha she'ef shel batla. So we need a special pasuk for halacha. Elamar krav hikriv es hakoil hamizbecha. The Omar Mar, in this pasuk, when it says v'hikriv es hakoil hamizbecha, it's not referring to zrika or akrava. What it's really referring to is zu halachas evarim l'kevesh. That's being moilech the evarim. V'tanya v'hikrivu zu kabbalas hadam. So it uses the word v'hikrivu to refer to Kabbalah Adam, the after Achman Kabbalah, the Lashon Halacha, the Memra Dailacha Loisafka Michlal Kabbalah. To tell us that Halacha would have the same Halacha as Kabbalah, and therefore it would require Lishma. Okay, Gabaltic. So now we've covered half of our issues. Ba'achkon Shinuya Kodesh. We have psukim to say that you have to have the right kavanah. You have to have the right kavanah. Shinu bailam inolam. Now, where are the psukim that teach us that you have to have kavanah for the right bailam? Omar Pinchas Bared Rabami Omar Kra. It says ubosar zevach toidas shalomov. What do we dash from this pasuk? Shetei zvicha l'shem toida. Ubosar zevach toidas shalomov. You should have zvicha l'shem toida. Now the problem is, I don't need a pasuk to tell me that the shechita has to be l'shma, because we already had a different pasuk. The b'zavach shlomim karbonai, right? We already learned that it has to be l'shma. So ameina inyan l'shinu kodesh the nafkalon mehosam, because we learned it up. We learned it out of the pasuk at the beginning of the Amud that said b'zavach shlomim karbonai. So therefore tanayu inyan l'shinu bayim. Correct. Gemara v'hayla hachiyu da'asa. You're telling me the uvasar zavach toida shlomov is to tell you shinu bayim? We needed to teach us a different halacha. It says, "Ubasar zavach toida shlomov abachanin oimer mishum Rabbi Eliezer." You know what this pasuk is teaching us? Bo lelamed toida sheshachta l'shleim shlomim kshera. If you shechted a carbon toida and you had kavanah for a shlomim, it's kosher, because lemaisa that's what a toida is. But shlomim sheshachta l'shem toida. But if you shechted a shlomim l'shem a specific toida and it wasn't, then it would be psula. Mahefresh ben zelos. What's the difference? Because toida kriya shlomim, ve'in shlomim kriya toida. All cows are animals, but not all animals are cows, right? Zog to Gemara, anan mizevach kamrina. Your drasha is from toida shlomov. My drasha is from zevach. So therefore, I still have the extra zevach to tell you that the shechita has to be l'shem shlomim, but I don't need it to tell me that, because I already know that. So it's telling me that the shechita has to be for the right bailim. You know, we know the halacha is a toida can be eaten for that day and the following night. A chatas and a osham has that same period of time it can be eaten for. Where do we know it from? We know it from zevach. From the extra word zevach, we learned that not only does this apply to a toida, this time limitation for achila applies to a chatas and osham. I still have an extra word to dash from. If it was only trying to tell you the Zman Achila, then what the pasuk should have said was Ubasar Zevach Toida Shlomov, Ubasar Toida Shlomov Zevach, because you know what the next words in the pasuk is? B'yom Karbana Yayochel. So if we're trying to extend B'yom Karbana Yayochel to other karbanos using the word Zevach, Zevach should be right there. Zevach B'yom Karbana Yayochel. But Zevach is all the way at the beginning of the pasuk. Ubasar Zevach Toida Shlomov, when we're talking about the Shechita, so since it's also out of place, my Zevach, Shemami Notarti, we can get the extra limit from. So now we found the makor that when you shech the carbon, you have to shech the carbon l'shem the proper bible. Zokmar Ashrechan Zvicha. Okay, so we found Zvicha. Shara Avoidus Minayin. Now we need to find the same makor for Kabbalah, for Halacha, and for Zrika. If you want to say Leilach Mizvicha, Mal Zvicha, Shekein Poisel, Shaloi L'Shem Oichlim B'Pesach. We already know that Shechita has a chumrah. Nemra Zvicha B'Shinui Kodesh, V'Nemra Zvicha B'Shinu Bailim. Let's learn it this way. We know we have Zvicha B'Shinu Kodesh. We just went through that. And now we just introduced Zvicha B'Shinu Bailim. So let's say, Ma Zvicha Amur B'Shinu Kodesh, Lo Chalakta Ben Zvicha L'Shar Avodos. Zvicha B'Shinu Kodesh, we said it applies to all avodas. Why? Because we brought specific psukim to extend this halacha to our avodas. But once we already know that all the avodas are similar in respect to Shinu Kodesh, so now let's say as well, it passes on to Shinu Bailam. Av Zvicha Amur B'Shinu Bailam, L'Sachlik Behen Ben Zvicha L'Shar Avodos. Zok Gemara, I have 4 reasons why they would be a bigger tzad to say that Shinu Kodesh should be a bigger problem than Shinu Bailam, and Shinu Bailam shouldn't be a problem. 4 reasons. Ikal Mifra, Mal Shinu Kodesh, Shekain Psula Begufa. Shinu Kodesh is a psul in the guf. You're passing the carbon itself, not just to whom it's going for. It's touching the carbon itself. And the Yeshnoi Ba'arba Avoides. It applies to all 4 avoides. So you think, what do you mean it applies to all 4 avoides? That's what we're talking about, applying it to all 4 avoides. So this is where we have to make that distinction. So look at Rashi here. A new chiddush we're going to learn. Shem shachat shaloi l'shmoi, oy kibel v'holach v'zorg shaloi l'shmoi, af al pi shaloi chishev ela avav shaloi chishev. This is a very important test. Af al pi shaloi chishev al manas lizroik shaloi l'shmoi. Even though you didn't think al manas lizroik shaloi l'shmoi, it will be possible. So by shchita shaloi l'shem kodesh, any avoida b'shasta avoida that you didn't, not l'shem kodesh, it would not l'shem the right carbon, it'll be a problem. Aval shinu bailam loy shayach ela bezrika. Shinu bailam applies only to the zrika because that's the part where it's mechaper on the person. So therefore, the hader rabina and shchita live so b'shinu bailam. It doesn't mean I shechted and I had commanded that the shchita should be for the wrong bailam. It means I shechted and I'm a nice lizroik liskaper boy acher. So the only avoida shaloi l'shem bailim is only if you have kavanah not to do the zrika l'shem bailim. The discussion is, what if by the shchita I had kavanah not to do the zrika l'shem bailim? What if by the Kabbalah I had kavanah not to do the zrika l'shem bailim? That's what's also. But having kavanah to do the shchita shaloi l'shem bailim is not a problem at all. So the shaloi l'shma of kodesh is more chomer, even if we do have a limit for it, because it applies to each avoida. While the psul of a shaloi l'shem bailim is only to kavanas to do the zrika, not l'shem bailim. So that's what means the yeshna b'shar avodos, the yeshna lachamisa. You can have a shinu carbon lachamisa because if the owner of the carbon dies, you could still have kavana for a shlomim instead of an oila, for an oila instead of a shlomim. But to have a shinu bailam after a guy dies, you can't have a shinu bailam because there's no l'shem bailam anymore. The bailam's dead already. And v'yeshnoi b'tzibur k'biyachid. By carbon tzibur, you can also change the owner, but you cannot change the owner by tzibur because every single person of the tzibur is one of the owners. So therefore, you couldn't possibly change the owner. So let's stop over here. I just want to point out that there's a massive kash on here. What do you mean you can't have a kavanah for a shinu bailam by a tzibur? What are you talking about? What if you have kavanah for a goy? A goy is not part of the tzibur. So that's one of the kashas that are asked over here, which we'll get to tomorrow because we're running late. So we'll stop here with Mamshech tomorrow. We learned the blot, but I was hoping to learn a blot and a half. So we're still only now 1 Omer ahead.